My grandparents' town was cleaned out. During the siege I could climb on a nearby hill and watch as the mortars hit the red brick roofs of the houses. The houses were burning, and people were being exterminated left and right. My grandmother's aunt, she was over 80 years old, was hooked by her throat. Imagine a pirate hook, someone puts it in your throat and rips it out. That is how she was killed. My father's cousin was taped to a Serb army jeep and driven to a nearby Serb hospital. Inside the jeep was a wounded Serb. They tied my father's cousin to the front and drove him on the hood just in case someone tried to shoot at the Serbs. He survived and would come back a couple days later into my town with his whole family. He came there and lived with my uncle and grandfather, my father's parents, for a few weeks till the Serbs came and took everyone away. Me and my mom went to see her parents in the nearby village, where they stayed with some relatives. We got them to come and live with us in our town. Now I had both of my grandparents living with us in the same town. My father's house, my two uncles and my grandfather's house were all only a few hundred feet away. During the nights, we would sleep in the basements of the nearby neighbor houses. The Serbs were shelling nearby towns at night. It got old waking up at 2 a.m. once the shells start coming down, then going to a neighbor's basement. I remember one night my cousin, who was about 10 at that time, did not want to wake up. There was no electricity, all you can hear is shells falling down. Our house was safe as a few hundred meters were a dozen or so Serb houses. But my father still made us go to the shelter. My grandma was crying and pulling on my cousin to wake up. He was sound asleep with the shells falling down. He said, "I don't care, let them kill me, I am tired of this every night." Once he said that, I laughed so much because I felt the same way. I did not care anymore. I wanted to sleep in my own house and bed. But still that night we went to the shelter. We were only little kids. My father's other brother lived in another city, and he was arrested by the Serbs and jailed because he had a gun, a registered gun before the war, years before the war. He was beaten daily. He was a professor at the local university. The men in his jailhouse were taken by day and shot executed. The day that his turn came up to get killed, a young Serb lieutenant came to escort him to the shooting place. As he saw my uncle, he hugged him and said, "Professor, I can't believe they have you here. I will take you home." My uncle was saved that day, but we had no idea. We have not heard from him for weeks. We would find out his story only months later, when we saw him in another city. The extra family members living with us now meant the food supply was really short. There was no food, no stores to buy food, no money to buy food. We were not allowed to travel anywhere. People started starving and looking for anything edible to eat. People started stressing, women started crying, those that have lost loved ones started asking why they weren't killed too. At least once a week in the middle of the night, Serbs would come to our front door, early morning hours 1 or 2 a.m. They would ask for my father. Every time I would wake up and look at my father, he would touch me on the head and say, "It's okay, son, he'll be back," but in his eyes I knew what he was thinking. This might be the last time I see him. My father brought in weapons and sold weapons to the Muslims, many of them. My father's boss, who was in jail beaten by Serbs daily, all he had to do was say my father's name, and that would be the end of that. The Serbs would ask my father to start up the nearby flour mill and to work. My father's friend and a Serb was tasked to watch over the operation and watch over my father so the Serbs do not kill him. This is the first time that I saw my father's friend with a gun holstered to his belt. For some reason I felt that my father was safe there with this our Serb friend. I was right, he was safe, but it made me wonder, what has this come to? A friend watching over a friend with a gun, friends and neighbors that are now enemies. The food was scarce, no electricity, no running water, no movement out of the town. I spent the days playing with my dogs, staying at home listening to my grandma talk about what she has seen. We were sitting in a fish bowl, and as the Serbs cleaned out the nearby towns we waited for our turn. I would go out into the fields with some boys that were left in the town, and we would roll up leaves in paper and smoke them. My father's relative, a funny guy, came over one day to my father and said, "Smoke this, it will relax you." It was weed, but I did not know at that time. They smoked and smoked, many of them. This guy had a plantation growing, a big wad of hundreds of douche marks on him. He was bawling, selling weed to the Serbs and everyone else. I never tried weed with them, even though that had me very interested in what the hell were they smoking. How could I get my hands on that? I never got a chance to smoke weed, even though I did know what it was. My father's cousin that came from my mother's parents' village was about 25 or so, young man with a young family. A very nice guy. He would spend a lot of time with me going places looking for food. Many of the Muslim homes were empty as they all fled before the war began and the systematic ethnic cleansing. We hardly ever found any food anywhere. By this time I stopped feeding my 2 dogs. They were very thin, could not walk and play anymore. They would disappear for days at a time, I don't know where, maybe food hunting. This is why I'm sharing my story. It is hard for someone born here in the USA to understand what me and some of my Bosnian brothers went through. You might think it's copy and paste, that it's not real, that it's made up. I will tell you no, there are thousands of stories like mine and people that had it even worse. Whenever you think that you have it bad in the USA, remember you are sheltered like a baby here and have nothing, absolutely nothing to complain about. Be grateful, I am. One day a local from the town, a young guy about 24, went fishing at the river. He was a really nice guy. His name was Samir. One of the greatest soccer players I seriously have ever seen. He would score a goal from the midfield, had such an amazing kick and control of the ball would fly like a bullet. I was always impressed by his skills. I looked up to this young guy. He played for the local team and was the best possibly in the region. He went fishing and was never heard of again. His parents and the folk in the town started to worry about him. One of my relatives said that he was fishing that day and saw him too, but does not know what happened to him. He said that he was shot at from across the river by Serbs with a handgun. They almost got him, but he ran home and never went fishing again in that area. His name was Omar, and he was a really nice guy too. He was related to my father somehow. Married man about 30 years old and had a wife and 2 kids. Omar was later killed by an unexploded mortar where he found it when he was fighting the Serbs. He found the mortar in a park and took it to the base to get it disarmed. Omar fled to the Bosnian Muslim side, took up arms, and was fighting against the Serbs. While walking back with the mortar, his axe hit the mortar and it exploded, blew him in half. He lived for about 5 minutes or so after that. I decided I would go to the river again and swim. It was a hot summer, and I was bored. Walking to the river through the fields, I heard a machine gun go off. The Serbs driving by in trucks opened fire on the mosque. The mosque was one of the left ones in the whole region. The rest, when the Serbs cleaned out the villages, they burned down or blew up the mosques. While I was walking to the river, I heard the machine gun and saw white smoke coming from the mosque as the large white minaret was getting hit with bullets. Walking through the fields, I smelled the worst possible smell ever, the only smell that a decomposing body can have. I walked up on the remains of Samir, the soccer player. At that time I did not recognize him. I saw a body lying there, naked with scars all over the torso. Maggots were all over the cut-up chest and stomach. The head was decomposed, and the head was severed from the body. The head was located next to his torso. I ran back to the first house, which belonged to my father's cousin. He was not there, but I told his mother. I went home and told my mother. She yelled at me for going to the river and yelled at me for going to inspect the body. I had nightmares about that body for years after. Samir was buried the next day. His parents did not recognize him, but they only recognized the clothes that he had on him. The pants and the belt was all that he had on him. His mother never believed that it was her son, dead like that. Later, after the war, she was called and someone asked her $10,000 and they would give her information about Samir. I don't know what happened to that, but I am pretty sure that was Samir. He was tortured and killed. Took about a week for the body to show up. Who knows how many days he was tortured and how he was killed. The chest on his torso had all kinds of cuts, his back as well, looks like he was cut with a sharp object and tortured. Then later his head was severed from the body. I don't know why someone would do something like that. I went to the funeral. I saw them put the body casket in the grave But I continued to have dreams and nightmares about it. To this day I have that image burned in my mind, and it is clear as it was that day when I first saw the body. The Muslim population of the town was now terrified, no one had any food, and no one had any place to go. The Serbs that lived in the town were scared for us too, I would like to think. My father's Serb friends would come over and talk about the front lines, about the war, and how they hate what is happening to us all. One day as we were sitting in the living room, my mother, my two siblings, my father and my mother's parents, I saw a soldier in uniform walking up the street. I said to my mom, "Look, a soldier just walked by." She said, "Where?" I did not see one. "What are you talking about?" As we looked out the window, our living room door opened and two Serb soldiers with Alaska S pointed at us were standing there. The two Serb soldiers came in and said, "Do you have any weapons in the house?" My father said, "No, we do not have any weapons." One of the Serbs said, "What if we check and find some? Which one of your kids do we kill?" My father said, "Check, we do not have any weapons, and neither of my kids is going to die today." By this time a third soldier walked in, saw my father and said, "Hey, don't worry, everything is good." He grabbed the other two soldiers and pushed them out. He said to my father, "We are here to collect all of the refugees that came from the village." My father said, "These are my in-laws, they are fine to stay here with me. Do not take them." The soldier said, "We have to, there is no choice, we have to take them." By this time, my mother's father, my grandfather stood up and said, "Okay, let me get my bags and we are coming with you." My grandma started crying and my mother, the soldier said to my father, "I am sorry, but these are my orders." My father said, "I understand." I would not see my grandparents for at least 3 months again. They were taken to a factory in the center of the city. There they were put in a big hole and made lay down on the concrete. There was no bathroom or anything in the area. People had to use a corner of the big hole to go to the bathroom. The place started to reek and they were not given food or water for days at a time. Mothers with young children had the hardest time. For many of the women the worst was yet to come. The younger women were picked out and led into a room. There they were raped by Serb soldiers. One after another took their turns raping the women. The women then were led back into the hole and nobody said anything. This lasted for 9 days. The people were all rounded up and put into semi-trucks, some were put into box trucks, and they were all transported to the Bosnian Muslim and Catholic side. Many of the Bosnian Muslim cities and Catholic cities were able to defend themselves from the Serbs. The Serbs decided to ship all of the remaining Muslims and Catholics to those cities, such as Tuzla and Travnik. My grandparents were dropped off on top of a mountain with the rest of the people the Serbs had caught. They walked about 15 miles to get to the safety of the Bosnian army and the safe zone. The men that were gathered and in the hall for 9 days were mostly taken and sent to the Manjaka concentration camp. Google that for pictures. Now that the Serbs collected the refugees from the other villages, there was only a few smaller villages and towns with a Muslim population left. I felt that we are a small number and they will easily dig a large grave, execute us and just bury us. A very simple task and an easy job to do. Now the depression set in for everyone, the fear and the not knowing, included with hunger, no electricity, people were anxious to leave. I spent a lot of time with my grandfather, my father's father. He would tell me how he survived during WW2, how he served in the Yugoslav army. He told me how after his father's death in WW2 him and his older brother with their mother lived in a small mud hut. The mud hut would be surrounded by wolves at night in the winter, and his older brother would have to sit at the door and hold the door so the wolves do not come in. They lived in the end of the town, and this was the late 1940s. There was no electricity or major roads in the area. We all just kind of hanged out at home, sat there in silence and wondered, what will happen to us? My father was busy during the day working for the Serbs. My mother cried a lot. Me and my siblings did not do much but stay at home and just wait for the inevitable. Some Serbs would come by and say, "Do not worry, we will organize a transport out of here, you will go over to the Muslim side and you people will be fine." This kind of gave us hope, but my father knew that they would not let him go. He was the only one left that knew how to operate the machinery at the factory where he worked for the Serbs now. It was finally time for us to leave. We had packed bags of stuff we needed to bring. The hardest part for me was watching my grandfather cry. His father, and his father's father, and generations back, all have bled on that land where we lived. They have bled, died and fought on that land, lived and were buried there. My grandfather cried for hours at a time, would sit there, smoke, pet his dog and cry. I did not understand why he was in such pain at that time. But now I understand why. He always knew though, that land was his, and no one would be able to take it from him. Sooner or later he would be back. We got all of our stuff together. What I missed the most was leaving my dogs. I sat there with my grandfather and watched as he cried petting his dog. My dog was at my feet, like he knew that he would be alone from then on. We all walked to the center of the town. The Serbs had brought semi-trucks there. No buses, just semi-trucks. People were anxious to get on the trucks and leave. People started moving around and trying to jump into the trucks, as if there was not enough trucks for everyone. Commotion ensued, and one of the Serb soldiers pointed his Alaska in the air and let out a burst of bullets. He said, "Calm down everyone," and then pointed the gun at the people. He said, "Wait your turns. You will all have time to leave and space. We will be bringing in more trucks." Me and my mother and 2 siblings waited for another truck. The truck came. My father came with us. He decided he had to leave. He knew if he stayed he would be the only Muslim left in the area. On top of that, when the Muslims attacked to take back the area, he would be killed, no doubt about it. My father's Serb friend, the one that was watching over him, told him, "I will take care of the factory, you have to leave." He came over a night before we were to leave, he said. When they ask me what happened, I will just say you left and that I did not see you. He then handed my father some money that he had saved up. This is why I do not hate all Serbs and the Serb people. We got onto the trucks and we started going. We drove for about 12 hours over some of the roughest mountain terrain. It was miserably hot summer day. When we drove through Serb towns, the children would throw rocks at the convoy and many people got hit by the rocks. We stopped at one of the creeks where people could get some water and get out of the trucks. We were locked in there like sheep. The sides and the rear of the truck were closed in. Imagine over 100 people in blistering heat inside a truck. There was hardly any air in there. Many people passed out. I do not know if anyone died. I do not remember much of it. I remember one of the drivers, a childhood friend, a Serb, told my dad, "What the fuck are you doing here? You are supposed to stay and work." My father said, "Shut the fuck up and keep your mouth shut. You did not see me." We got back into the trucks and started going again. We got on top of this mountain. It was a little past midnight. Pitch dark outside. The trucks stopped and Serbs in masks came and started telling people to get out. People were hesitant as the men were masked and it was pitch dark. All of a sudden a large caliber machine gun opened fire and the Serbs started yelling, get out, go now. Go down that road, stay off the sides of the road, watch for landmines and for dead bodies. The roads are mined, follow closely each other, do not get off the road." My mother and father took us by our hands and we started walking down this mountain road. It was pitch dark, no one had any lights, we just followed the people in the front in a large convoy walking. I would look at people from what I could see, old people, young people, children, hundreds of us walking this dark mountain road. People carried the old and the young. We had no idea where we were going and how long we are going to be walking. On the side of the road, you could see dead bodies. My mother would cover my eyes with her hand, but I had to look for some reason. Bomb craters were all over the road as well. I am off work, guys. I will update more tonight when I get to work. As we were walking down the mountain, the side of the mountain was lit up by the moonlight. Now you can see clearly the craters and the dead bodies of the refugees that were killed on the way to wherever they were going. I was holding my mother by her hand, my older sister was walking behind us, and my father carried a large bag with some clothes, and my littler brother, who was about 5 at that time, he walked with us as much as possible. About half an hour into the walk, masked Serbs came off the side of the mountain. They pulled out knives and guns and started hitting people in the face, robbing people for belongings. They made some men take off their watches, the women had to take off their jewelry. One of them came up to my mother, grabbed her by her jacket and said, "Give me the money, give me your money." My mother said, "I don't have anything, leave me alone, take the jacket." He pushed her and walked off. By this time my father, who was in front, came back and grabbed my mom and me and told us to keep walking. We walked for hours, I think it was over 4 hours, until we reached a tunnel in the road. We were up in the front of the big caravan. The tunnel was pitch dark, but we had no choice but to go into the tunnel. Some people had a flashlight and started using the flashlight in the tunnel. As we approached the middle of the tunnel, you could see a big pile of rocks in the middle of the tunnel. Big rocks, I'm thinking the size of cars, one on each side and a small space in between for people to start walking in. As the first people of the caravan started going through, and with some light that people had using flashlights, an armed man with an Alaska pointed at us jumped out of the dark corners of the tunnel. People stopped walking and started looking at him. He said, "Welcome to the Muslim Bosnia side." He then lit up a cigarette. He said, "You are about halfway to Travnik, a city that would let us stay there that was occupied by Muslim and Catholic armed forces." One woman walked up to the soldier and kissed him. She said, "Thank God for us finally making it here." We walked through the tunnel and finally started passing some villages along the road. We found a fountain near the road with running water. We all got some water and rested. It should have been about 4 a.m. by now. My father still carried that big bag, and my little brother was still walking. In front of the fountain I slipped on the mud and fell, got all dirty. My mom did not yell at me or care much. We continued walking and complaining. I kept asking my father, "When will we reach Travnik?" He did not say much, said, "Shut up and keep walking. Do not talk, shut up and keep walking." We walked for hours more, and it was starting to get light out. I finally started seeing some homes alongside the road. Many of them were burned down with bullet holes in them. I started thinking about my home, my dogs. My grandfather and my grandmother were a few meters behind us. He said my dog, the smaller one, when we were put in the trucks and taken away, he said he saw the dog run after the truck until he just couldn't keep up anymore. I made a promise in my head that I will go back and find my dog. He was my best friend and the only friend during the war. Even in our last days together, I shared my meals with him so my mother would not find out. Even being malnourished and half dead, he still had the energy to play with me. We finally arrived after it felt like we walked for days, but it was about 20 kilometers or so. We arrived at Travnik. It was a big school gymnasium. We walked in there in the morning hours. It was a rainy day and I felt sick and tired. We walked into the gymnasium and there was hundreds of people in there. There were people lying down all over. In the hallways, in the classrooms, all over. The school was packed with refugees. I do not know what happened next. I laid down and fell asleep. I woke up the next day and I could not walk from my calves and legs being so sore. I told my mom and she said, "It is okay, you will be fine, it's all the walking we did." I went outside and started walking around the school. I did not see many people around, only army trucks driving by. The school smelled horrible and it smelled like everyone was sick in there. The bathrooms were clogged up and dirty. I started walking around and came back inside. I do not know where my father was. I asked my mother and she said he went to take care of some paperwork so we can get into Croatia, as my uncle's wife was there in the capital of Croatia, Zagreb. We spent another night there and then the next morning, my father said, "We have to leave from here or we will all get sick. We have to move to Stari Travnik, that is where they have another school, and from there we will go to Croatia." In Croatia, a small coastal town Novi Vinodolski, that is where my mother had an uncle, and he had a huge house and a restaurant there, where he lived and worked. We got onto a bus and we were bused to Stari Travnik. We got to a school and went to one of the classrooms where we would sleep. I slept on a wooden desk with a small blanket to cover myself. I do not know how I slept on there as it was very uncomfortable and cold. I could feel myself moving every few minutes to adjust. My parents and siblings slept on the floor on some cardboard boxes. The people of Stari Travnik brought us some food, but there was hardly any to share for over 500 people. The next day the army brought some bread there, hardly enough. I think I remember eating a couple slices of bread from my mother and father. This went on for a couple days. I did not get out of the school much. I would walk out and just check out the bullet holes in the outside of the school. My parents forbid me to venture out. I remember one morning walking by this iron fence by the school. My parents warned me of sniper fire. As I was running along the fence, something in my mind told me to duck and run faster. As I did that, I heard a loud ping like a bullet hitting an iron fence a few inches above my head. I stopped venturing out after that for a few days. There was no more food. The Croats, Catholics and Muslims started beefing now. The Serbs told the Croats if they did not back Travnik and the Muslims they would keep a part of Bosnia. One night the Croats started shelling Stari Travnik. One of the Muslim soldiers came into the school where we were sleeping. He had a Motorola radio on him. I could hear him yelling into the radio and cursing at the Croats. He was telling them, "Do not shell the fucking school. It is only refugees here, that is it, do not shell the school." The school was not shelled. We ended up going into the basement of the school and sleeping on the concrete. Some of the men volunteered to go and fight against the Croats, but they were not given weapons and were told to stay in the school. My father's brother, the uncle with the dog whose wife and children were in Croatia, came down in the basement with a burqa on his head and hid. That made me laugh at him so much. Even the women there were like, "What the hell are you doing?" He said, "I have to see my wife and children at least one more time. I do not want to die." This went on for a few nights and days. We stayed in the school. My mother was able to get an onion from someone. She took the onion and put it in a plate, baked it and fed it to me and my siblings. The smell of the onion and the taste was the best food I had ever eaten. Now I know why. It is because we have not eaten for 3 days. One night the Muslims brought in wounded soldiers. My father went up there with some tools, pliers and some knives. He ended up taking out shrapnel from some soldiers' bodies. I remember walking by a table with a soldier lying on his face, his back all bloodied up, and my father digging in there with a knife. The Croats and Muslims stopped fighting after about a week. It all went back to normal. We went back to Travnik the next day. We slept at some people's apartment one night, and I could walk by the working restaurants there and smell the food, but I did not ask my mother to go buy us food. I knew we had no money, and even if we had any, it was little and buying lunch there meant nothing for us. My father went to the war command and told them that he wants to sign up to go to war, but they have to take care of his family, give us food and place to stay. They declined his offer, told him to get us out of Travnik and to come back. They actually had him sign a paper saying that he will come back and fight once he is able to take us out of Bosnia. We went back to Stari Travnik again to the school. It was fine now. The Croats and Muslims were not fighting, but tensions were high. My father found a local man from Travnik and started working for him. My father was a good handyman and welder machinist. One evening we were sitting there at the guy's house. Him and my father were drinking. He told my father a few times, "You are a sellout, you should have died in your town, you should have fought." My father said, "If I killed one Serb, what do you think would have happened to my family?" By this time the man got mad, but my father got up, grabbed him by his throat, and said, "If you ever talk to me like this again in front of my family, I will kill you." He told us to pack our stuff and leave right away. We left and went back to the school. Again my mother was able to get some flour. My father found some sheet metal and made some type of a cooking pan so my mother could bake us some bread. It tasted awful, but it was warm bread we had not eaten for days. I would go out with the other kids and walk from house to house. People would see us and close their blinds and doors. They did not answer their doors as already people walked by and asked for food. The whole country was at war. I do not blame them. They probably had no food either. The villages seemed empty when we would walk by. I ended up meeting a local boy that said he would take us to his house and that he had a full basement of pears and apples. He said we could have some. We went in the basement and started eating the fruit when a male voice yelled, "You thieves, I should kill you all now." We jumped out of the basement and ran away. I wanted to say, "But your son said we could eat here." It was too late, we ran away. I would run by and see soldiers going to the front lines on tanks and running. I would hear the tanks and mortars not too far away firing. I knew that was the direction not to go. I came back to the school where everyone was. My mother said, the Croats said, that we can leave Travnik for Posice in Croatia. I was happy to hear that. I knew that getting out of there was the way to go. The next day, buses were brought to the school. We were told that we are going to be taken to Posice, another city, and from there we would be able to go to Zagreb and look for aid. Denmark, Sweden, Germany and other European nations accepted refugees from the Bosnian conflict. From Zagreb, people would be able to get to Western Europe until the war was over. We got onto a bus and started heading towards Posice. We had to take a back way as many of the roads were blocked off and bridges destroyed. We had to navigate through a mountain pass and drive through small villages to get to Posice. We left one morning, and at night I would look outside the window of the bus, and the cliffs were only a few feet away. It was raining, and the buses jumped all over the road. It was a dirt mountain road. The buses had to do 3 to 4 point turns to make some of the big curves and continue going. We finally made it to an asphalt road, and it was daylight. We slept in the bus that day as we were not allowed to pass by the Croats. The Croats, armed, came into the bus and said, "Where are you people going? Croatia is not accepting any more refugees. Turn back." The bus drivers did not want to turn back, nor did the people in the buses. The Croats pointed at some of the men and cursed, said, "Where are you going? Go fight the Serbs." The men did not say anything. Some showed them the papers like my father had. The Croats just ripped them up and said they meant nothing in Croatia. We spent 2 days in a bus sleeping on the side of the road. We were then allowed to move forward and head towards Posice. A few hours later we arrived at Posice. We were dropped off at the center. The army and the police came there. They said, "Get back in the bus and go back to Travnik." We got back on the bus. The bus drivers drove for a few kilometers, stopped the buses and said, "Who wants to get out? Get out now. The rest are going back to Travnik." We got off the bus, me, my parents and the 2 siblings. It was a nice sunny day, I remember. We had a few bags and the 5 of us standing on the road. I looked at my father. I will never forget this moment, like it was yesterday. I said, "Dad, what are we going to do now?" He said, "I do not know, son. I do not know, but we can't stay here." We started walking towards Posice, got to a nearby hotel, sat by the front, while my father started asking around where we can stay and what we can do. No one there offered rooms or work. We were instructed to go to a nearby school where the refugees were. We got there again to a school. Outside in the yard of the school were porta potties. Dug out shitholes where people could go to the bathroom. Again, it smelled horrible. We walked into the gymnasium and the classrooms. One could not sleep there from the smell and the crying babies. We slept there for 3 days, I think. Some humanitarian agency, I think the Red Cross, brought food and cookies. I had a bunch of cookies, and I was happy for the rest of the day. The next day again I started walking around and venturing out. I got to a nearby Croat church and saw a couple of the humanitarian trucks being offloaded. I went back and told my father. He said, "Damn thieves, they are taking the goods meant for the refugees and are going to sell them. To some war means profit." I could not believe people could be so inhumane, watch others suffer from starvation while they sell the food that was meant for them. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe.